My name is Maren Whitlock. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a credit risk analyst for a regional bank in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I spend my days reading loan files, measuring debt, studying signatures, and calculating how long it takes for one bad obligation to collapse a person's life. I know exactly what a piece of paper can do when the wrong name is placed on the wrong line. Last August, at my parents' 35th anniversary party, my mother handed me a folder in the Fellowship Hall of St. Anselm's Church and said, in front of 46 people, "Sign the debt papers for your brother. Don't embarrass this family tonight." She said it softly, like a prayer. That was my mother's gift. She could make a command sound like a blessing if there were enough people watching. My father stood beside the cake table, one hand resting on the back of a folding chair, staring at the floor like the carpet had asked him a question. My brother Nolan was by the punch bowl in a navy blazer he couldn't afford, smiling at me like this was already settled. And near the gift table stood a man I had only seen once before from across my parents' driveway. Graham Voss. Dark suit. Silver watch. The kind of smile lenders wear when somebody else is about to become collectible. The folder had his company logo on the corner. Voss Capital Recovery. My mother pushed a pen toward me. "Just help him get through this," she said. "You're the practical one." People began looking at me the way families look at the difficult daughter. My Aunt Maureen folded her arms. Someone whispered Nolan's name like he was the injured party. But what none of them knew was that 4 days earlier, I had already sent my name somewhere they couldn't reach. And before that night was over, the room my mother chose to trap me in would become the first room where the truth finally had witnesses. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 42%, comment 1. If it is below 42%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. That sentence, the practical one, had followed me longer than any nickname my family ever gave me. In the Whitlock house, practical meant available. It meant I knew which bill was due, which insurance policy was about to lapse, which appliance had been making the wrong sound for too long. It meant I could be trusted with emergencies, but not celebrated for solving them. 6 years before that anniversary party, when I was 26, my father's doctor told him the warehouse floor was finished with him. Cal Whitlock had managed inventory for a food distribution company outside Lancaster for almost 30 years. He knew every loading bay, every night shift driver, every broken pallet jack by sound. Then, one February morning, his chest tightened while he was checking a freezer shipment, and by spring, he was home for good, walking slower, pretending not to be afraid of stairs. My mother closed the storefront side of Lenora's Lilies 2 months later. She still did wedding flowers out of the garage for women at church, mostly the ones who thanked her loudly afterward, but the steady money was gone. At first, everyone called it temporary. One smaller paycheck, one delayed bill, one repair pushed to next month. Then temporary became the new shape of the house. The red brick place on Hawthorne Mill Road started telling the truth before anyone else did. First, it was the property tax notice, folded under a church bulletin. Then the insurance premium marked final reminder. Then the back porch sagging where rain had been getting in for years. My mother called those things little rough patches. I called them liabilities, because that was my job. At Keystone Valley Bank, I spent 8 hours a day reading the difference between what people hoped they could afford and what the numbers said they could survive. So I paid the first tax bill, $1,180, then $740 for the insurance, then $2,600 for the porch because my father's left foot dragged when he was tired, and I could not sleep imagining him stepping through rotten wood. When I asked whether Dad knew the total, my mother looked at me like I had said something vulgar. "Don't make a production out of it," she said. "Family helps quietly." I believed her. That was the embarrassing part. I thought quiet meant dignity. But quiet only applied to me. When Nolan drove Dad to one cardiology appointment, my mother posted 3 photos before they made it home. "A son who shows up is a blessing," she wrote, with 2 red hearts and a folded hands emoji. By dinner, Aunt Maureen had commented, "That boy has such a giving heart." I had taken off 2 half-days that same month to argue with the insurance company, but there was no photograph for that. A phone call does not look holy. A bank transfer does not stand beside your mother with one arm around her shoulders. At Sunday dinners, Nolan arrived late and left early, usually smelling like cologne and somebody else's money. He talked about ideas the way other people talked about weather. A mobile coffee trailer, a storage unit resale business, a guided fishing app, even though he had not fished since high school. My mother listened like he was reading scripture. "He has vision," she would say. When I got promoted to senior analyst, she patted my hand and said, "That's steady work, honey." "Nolan, tell Marin about the RV plan." The refrigerator became the family altar. Nolan's business cards went under magnets. A photo of him standing beside a rented trailer stayed there for 9 months. My promotion letter never made it past my purse. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a good salary, a clean credit report, and a folder in my apartment labeled Hawthorne receipts. Every check, every transfer, every invoice sat there in date order. Back then, I thought I was keeping records because I was careful. I thought one day, if things ever got confusing, I could open that folder and remind myself I had done the right thing. I did not understand yet that paper remembers what families rewrite. And one day, those quiet little receipts would be the only witnesses willing to tell the truth. At the next Sunday dinner, I brought the insurance renewal in my purse because I had finally learned not to leave papers loose on their kitchen table. It was November, cold enough that the windows fogged during dinner, and my mother had made pot roast because pot roast was what she cooked when she wanted a room to feel more grateful than it was. I waited until my father finished eating before I mentioned the back porch wiring. The electrician had found exposed copper near the outlet by the steps. It was not dramatic yet. That was how houses got people hurt. Quietly. One ignored repair at a time. "I paid the insurance before it lapsed," I said. "But we need to stop using this address for Nolan's business registrations until the wiring is fixed. It could affect the policy." My mother's fork paused halfway to her plate. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Long enough for me. Before she answered, the front door opened, and Nolan walked in carrying 2 pizza boxes, cologne entering the room before he did. "Thought I'd save everybody," he said, setting them on the counter beside the pot roast nobody had finished. My mother lit up like someone had opened curtains inside her. "Look at you," she said, actually standing. "Always thinking of everyone." She took out her phone. My father smiled into his napkin. Aunt Maureen, who had come over after church and somehow stayed for dinner, clapped her hands once and said, "That boy has timing." I sat there with a folder of paid bills in my purse and watched my mother take 3 photos of Nolan holding $30 of pizza like he had carried a family through winter. When I tried again, softer this time, my mother's face changed. "Marin," she said, with that careful sweetness she used when other people were listening. "Must you always bring money into everything?" The room went still in the way. Rooms do when everyone knows a line has been crossed but wants someone else to name it. "I'm talking about insurance," I said. "You're talking about paperwork," she replied. "Your brother brings joy. You bring paperwork." Aunt Maureen looked at me over her glasses. "Some people help because they love," she said. "Some people keep receipts." My father kept cutting a piece of meat that was already cut. That was how he disappeared from every hard moment. Not by leaving the room. By staying in it and making himself smaller than the truth. I wanted to open my purse and lay every receipt across the table. I wanted to say the porch, the tax bill, the insurance, the water heater, the appointments, all of it had my name on it. Instead, I folded my napkin, stood up, and carried my plate to the sink. That was the thing about being trained to hold a family together. Even when they humiliate you, your hands still know where the dishes go. While I rinsed gravy from my mother's good china, I heard Lenora lower her voice behind me. "Don't worry, Nolan," she said. "I'm going to find a way to put something solid under your feet." The faucet was running, but I heard every word. And for the first time, I wondered whose ground she was planning to take to build it. I left my mother's kitchen with my hands smelling like dish soap and roast beef, and I made it as far as the Weiss Market's parking lot before I stopped pretending I was fine. I parked under a light that kept flickering like it had a decision to make, turned off the engine, and sat there with both palms flat against the steering wheel. My purse was on the passenger seat. Inside it, the insurance renewal sat folded beside the folder of receipts I had been too ashamed to open at dinner. My phone buzzed twice before I looked down. Brielle Knox. She was coming off a 12-hour shift in the ER, which meant she had either seen something terrible or had no patience left for people pretending terrible things were normal. I answered, and before she even said hello, she asked, "Did you go to Sunday dinner?" I laughed once, but it came out wrong. Brielle went quiet. Nurses know the sound of a person swallowing pain before they know the story. I told her about the insurance, the wiring, the pizza, my mother's sentence, Aunt Maureen's little sermon about receipts. I even told her about my father cutting the same piece of meat until it had nowhere left to go. Brielle listened without interrupting. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She did not rush to make pain inspirational. She let it be ugly first. When I finished, she said, "Marin, would they still call it family if your name wasn't useful on the papers?" I stared through the windshield at a woman pushing a cart full of groceries toward a minivan. The question should have been easy. Of course they would. They were my parents. Nolan was my brother. Families were supposed to be more than utility. But I sat there in the humming dark with my bank app still open and could not make the words come out. 3 days later, I went back to Hawthorne Mill Road to clear the back gutter before the next rain. My parents were at a church committee meeting, and Nolan's rented trailer was gone from the driveway, leaving 2 muddy tire tracks across the side yard. I had one foot on the ladder, already knowing I should have waited for someone else, and already knowing I wouldn't. That was the problem with being the dependable one. Eventually, even common sense starts sounding like something you can postpone. Sybil Harrow called my name from behind the fence before I reached the second rung. Sybil was 79, small-boned and straight-backed. With silver hair she pinned so tightly it looked like discipline. She had lived next door since before my parents bought the house, and she knew more about that street than the township did. She was holding garden shears in one hand and a mug of tea in the other, because Sybil believed every conversation deserved either a blade or a beverage. "You shouldn't be on that ladder alone," she said. "I'm fine," I told her. That's what dependable women always say right before somebody leaves them up there. I climbed down because arguing with Sybil was like arguing with weather. She waved me over to the fence and studied my face for a second too long. "Your mother had company last week," she said. I thought she meant Maureen, or one of the ladies from church. "A man," Sybil continued. "Not family. Dark suit. Blue, maybe. Shiny watch. He stood by the garage with Lenora and Nolan. He didn't come to the front door," Sybil said. "Men who mean well usually don't mind porches." Something small moved in my stomach. What did he look like? Like he makes a living explaining bad news in a calm voice. That was when I remembered the shape of Nolan's smile at dinner. Too easy, too loose. I remembered my mother saying she would put something solid under his feet. And suddenly the sentence did not sound like comfort. It sounded like planning. Sybil leaned closer over the fence. "I've watched you carry bags of salt in February. I've watched you meet roofers here before breakfast. I've watched you come by after work with your badge still clipped to your coat. Your mother may not keep your column of the ledger, but I do." My throat tightened so fast I had to look down. Then she said the sentence I would carry into everything that came after. "A family can call you dependable until they mean disposable." The wind moved through the bare branches over Hawthorne Mill Road. Somewhere inside my parents' house, the old gutters ticked as water shifted in them. I looked back at the garage, at the muddy tracks, at the latter still leaning against the house like a question I had not answered. I did not know the man's name yet. I did not know about Voss Capital Recovery, or the debt, or the papers that would later appear under anniversary lights. But I knew this much. Somebody outside my family had stepped into whatever problem my mother was keeping from me. And whatever he wanted. She had not invited me to the conversation. That was the first time I stopped feeling unappreciated and started feeling targeted. By the first Sunday in December, Lancaster had gone gray and cold in that flat Pennsylvania way, and I had almost convinced myself Sybil's man in the blue suit was just another uncomfortable detail my family would never explain. My mother had invited everyone for dinner because Nolan had exciting business news. In our family, that phrase usually meant he had found a new way to call debt ambition. He arrived with a rolled-up poster board under one arm and a confidence I recognized from loan applications that had no business being approved. He spread the board across the dining table before dessert. Whitlock Roadway Rentals, the logo said, with a drawing of an RV rolling toward a sunset. My mother clasped her hands under her chin. Isn't it beautiful? Nolan tapped the board like he was presenting to investors instead of relatives who still used the same chipped gravy boat every Thanksgiving. RV travel is exploding, he said. People want freedom. Families want experiences. I've already got 2 trailers lined up, and once I add 3 more units, cash flow changes completely. That sentence made the back of my neck tighten. People who understood cash flow did not say it changed completely. They said when. They said how. They said what happens if it doesn't. How are you financing the new units? I asked. Nolan's smile stayed on, but his eyes moved to my mother first. Short-term bridge money. Nothing crazy. From a bank? He laughed. Not everything has to go through your little risk department, Mayor. My mother's face sharpened. Your brother is building something. You wouldn't understand that because you get paid to say no. The table went quiet, but not in sympathy. It went quiet like everyone was waiting to see whether I would behave. I folded my hands under the table. I'm asking because insurance on commercial rentals can bury a new operator. So can repairs, storage fees, depreciation, late penalties. Marin, my mother said. Just my name. Soft, warning, shaped. Nolan leaned back in his chair. This is why I don't tell you things. You turn every dream into a spreadsheet. Aunt Maureen nodded like that was wisdom. My father rubbed 2 fingers against his chest, the way he did when stress entered the room and everybody was expected to lower their voices for his heart. So I lowered mine. I hope it works, I said. I do. But don't attach the house to it. Don't use Mom and Dad's address for filings. And don't sign anything with personal liability unless you know exactly where the money comes from if the season goes bad. My mother set her napkin beside her plate. That is an ugly way to talk about your brother's future. No, I said. It's an honest way. For a second, I thought she might actually hear me. Then she turned her eyes sad, not angry. Sad was more dangerous. Anger let people disagree with her. Sadness recruited them. Your father and I have spent our whole lives making sure you children had something solid under you, she said. Nolan is finally trying to build a legacy. He may need a little family support to get through the first stretch. That is not a crime. There it was again. Solid. Legacy. Support. Words polished smooth enough to hide the hook. What kind of support? I asked. Nolan reached for his water glass. My father looked down. My mother smiled at me like I had already agreed. Just standing behind him, she said. On paper, if necessary. I felt the room tilt a little, not enough to fall, enough to know the floor was not where it had been. No, I said. The word came out smaller than I wanted, but it came out. My mother blinked. Nolan looked offended, as if I had taken something from him instead of refusing to give him my life in advance. You haven't even heard the details, he said. I heard enough. Aunt Maureen sighed. Marin, your mother has done everything for you. Sometimes a daughter has to stop counting and start trusting. My father finally spoke, barely above the clink of ice in his glass. Maybe just read the papers first. That hurt more than Nolan's grin and my mother's performance combined. Because it sounded reasonable. Because it sounded like peace. Because it came from the man whose medical bills, porch steps, insurance gaps, and quiet emergencies had taught me to answer the phone no matter how tired I was. I looked at him and understood that silence had been practice. Dinner ended politely, which is how my family hid cruelty when there were no broken dishes to prove it. My mother wrapped leftovers for Nolan and sent him home with half the pie. I drove away with nothing but the sentence my father had left on the table. Maybe just read the papers first. 3 days later, I found a business card tucked behind a grocery coupon on my mother's refrigerator. Heavy cream stock, navy lettering, Voss Capital Recovery, private lending, and asset restructuring. And that was when support stopped sounding like family and started sounding like a trap. The card stayed in my hand longer than it should have. I stood in my mother's kitchen with the refrigerator humming beside me, and the blood moving too loudly in my ears. Voss Capital Recovery, private lending, and asset restructuring. Those were not church fundraiser words. Those were words people used when a regular bank had already said no, or when the borrower could not afford to hear what yes would cost. I turned the card over. On the back, in my mother's careful handwriting, was a time. Thursday, 10:15. The kitchen door opened before I could put it back. My mother came in carrying 2 grocery bags and stopped when she saw what was in my hand. For half a second, her face went blank. Then the curtain came down. "That," she said, too brightly, "that's nothing. Someone from church gave it to me. They sponsor community events." She crossed the room faster than she usually moved and slipped the card out of my fingers. "You know how people leave business cards everywhere." I watched her tuck it into her purse, not the junk drawer, not the trash, not the church basket by the phone, her purse. That was the first lie with a handle on it. I did not argue. I had argued enough at that table to know truth did not grow, where my mother had already salted the ground. I helped her put away groceries, apples in the bowl, milk in the fridge, paper towels under the sink. My hands did ordinary things while my mind began building a file. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop open and searched Graham Voss. I did not find much at first. People like him knew how to stay plain. Estate filing, a mailing address outside Harrisburg, a website with stock photos of smiling contractors and words like flexible capital, asset solutions, urgent liquidity. Then I found the reviews. Not many, just enough. One man said Voss had asked for another signer 2 days before closing. A woman wrote that the fees changed after her husband had already moved equipment onto a lot. I read until the numbers stopped being numbers and started forming a shape. Short-term money, high pressure, last-minute signatures, collateral dressed up as confidence. I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Nolan Risk File. The name looked cold, even to me, but cold was useful. Cold kept you from explaining away facts because the people involved had your last name. I saved screenshots of the website, the state filing, the reviews, and a picture of the card I had taken before my mother slipped it into her purse. Before I shut the laptop, I stared at the folder sitting beside Hawthorne receipts. One held everything I had already given. The other was beginning to hold everything they had not told me. For the first time, I did not feel guilty for keeping records. I felt late. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Just a heart emoji then. "Don't overthink Sunday, sweetheart." I looked at the message for a long time. Then I copied it into the file, because by then I had learned something simple. When someone tells you not to think, it usually means thinking is exactly what will save you. The Saturday my mother wanted me not to overthink was still 1 day away when I found the reason she was so afraid of my thoughts. By Friday evening, the weather had turned bitter, and I drove to Hawthorne Mill Road after work to pick up the socket set I had left in my father's desk. My parents were supposed to be at choir rehearsal. Nolan's trailer was gone. The porch light was on anyway, swinging slightly in the wind. making the front steps look like they were breathing. Inside, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and old heat. I found the socket set in the den, beside my father's roll-top desk. I was closing the drawer when the printer on the side table clicked once. A single page sat crooked in the tray, half fed, like the machine had tried to swallow it and changed its mind. I saw my name before I meant to read anything else. The email was from my mother, to Graham Voss. Subject line, Saturday timing. My fingers went cold around the paper. Marin may hesitate if she sees the full amount beforehand. Bring the simplified signature page. We'll present it after the toast. She won't refuse if everyone is watching. I read that last sentence 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. Below it was Graham's reply. As long as she signs the personal guarantee and acknowledgement of joint liability, we can pause collection action against Nolan. Personal guarantee. Joint liability. Those were not family words. Those were collection words. Those were wage garnishment words. Those were 7 to 10 years of your life words. I took out my phone and photographed the page, then scrolled the tiny print at the bottom where the thread continued. My father had answered too. 1 sentence, typed from the email account I had helped him set up after his heart surgery. Marin has always helped. She'll do what's right. Just don't upset Lenora at the party. I stood in that den with my coat still on and felt something in me go very still. My father had not been confused. He had not been left out. He had described my obedience to strangers like it was a family asset. Gravel cracked in the driveway. 2 car doors. My mother's laugh outside, bright and tired from church. I put the page back exactly how I found it, straightened the corner, slid the drawer shut, and walked to the kitchen with the socket set in my hand. When they came in, I was rinsing a mug that was already clean. My mother kissed my cheek like nothing in the world had shifted. "Wear something soft tomorrow," she said. "This family needs a gentle night." I smiled because I had finally learned what gentleness meant in my mother's mouth. It meant don't resist. It meant bleed quietly. It meant make the room comfortable for the people setting the trap. I drove home without turning on the radio. The whole way, 1 sentence sat beside me in the passenger seat. She won't refuse if everyone is watching. My mother's mistake was not thinking I was afraid of embarrassing her. Her mistake was writing down the place where she planned to bury me. I got home at 8:47 and set my coat on the back of a chair instead of hanging it up. The old Marin would have put everything where it belonged before letting herself fall apart. That night, I walked straight to the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and created a new folder inside Nolan Risk file. I named it Saturday Evidence because calling it what it was made, my hands stopped shaking. The first thing I saved was the photo of my mother's email. Then Graham's reply. Then my father's sentence. Marin has always helped. She'll do what's right. I zoomed in on those words until they blurred. My father had not promised them money. He had promised them me. That was the part I could not get around. My labor, my credit, my fear of making a scene, all of it had been discussed like collateral. I did not call Brielle first. I knew if I heard her voice, I might start crying, and crying would cost time. I called Everett Shaw, a financial attorney whose name I had gotten 2 years earlier from a woman at work after her ex-husband tried to leave her with a business loan. It was Friday night. I expected voicemail. Instead, a tired male voice answered after the 4th ring, and I said the sentence I had never imagined saying about my own family. "I think my mother is trying to make me sign a personal guarantee in front of witnesses tomorrow." There was a pause. Not dramatic, professional. The kind of pause people use when they know the next words matter. "Do you have documents?" he asked. "Yes." "Send them now." He told me this was not a full consultation at that hour, but it was enough to keep me from walking into Saturday blind. By 9:30, I had sent everything. The business card, the state filing, the reviews, the email thread, the text from my mother, the old messages where she asked me not to mention house bills to Maureen, and the Hawthorne receipts. I sent the voicemail Nolan had left 2 weeks earlier too, the one I almost deleted because it sounded stupid at the time. Mom said you'd sign if we kept it simple, he had said, laughing a little. Don't make me look bad, Mare. At 10:11, Everett called back. They're not asking you to help your brother, he said. They're asking you to become the collectible asset. I wrote that down on the back of an electric bill because I needed to see it outside my head. He walked me through it slowly. The phrase personal guarantee meant if Nolan defaulted, they could come after me directly. Joint liability meant it would not matter who benefited from the money. If my name went on that line, the debt could follow my wages, my savings, my credit, my chance at a mortgage, maybe for years. It would not care that I signed under pressure. It would not care that my mother cried first. Then he asked me the number. I told him I did not know the full amount. That's what worries me, he said. A few minutes later, Everett found what Nolan and my mother had hidden behind softer words. A public UCC filing connected to 2 trailers. A short-term note. Late fees already stacking. He could not see everything without the lender's packet, but he saw enough to estimate the exposure well over $500,000 before legal costs. I sat in my apartment, staring at the cheap light over my kitchen sink, and thought of my mother telling me to wear something soft. Everett told me not to confront them privately. People who plan pressure in public usually rewrite private conversations, he said. Let them bring the papers, but before they do, we make sure your refusal exists somewhere. They can't pretend not to see. When I hung up, the house was silent, except for the refrigerator and my own breathing. I opened the folder again. Hawthorne receipts sat beside Saturday evidence. One held proof of what I had already given. The other held proof of what they were about to take. For the first time, the 2 folders looked less like records and more like a door. By midnight, I had stopped shaking. Not because I felt brave, but because there is a kind of calm that arrives when the worst thing finally has a shape. Before that night, my fear had been fog. After Everett's call, it had numbers, names, dates, and a plan. I printed 3 copies of everything and laid them across my kitchen table in quiet rows. My apartment looked less like a home than a closing room, which felt appropriate. My family had decided Saturday would be paperwork, so I prepared like paperwork mattered. Everett emailed me the first letter at 12:18. Formal refusal to act as guarantor for any debt connected to Nolan Whitlock, Whitlock Roadway Rentals, Voss Capital Recovery, or any related restructuring agreement. The language was clean and dry. No anger, no daughterhood, just my name refusing to become a door someone else could open. The second document was scheduled to reach Voss Capital first thing in the morning. Any attempt to use my signature required direct verification through Everett's office. The third was the fraud alert, followed by credit freeze confirmations from the bureaus. My credit report became a locked room. I slept for maybe 2 hours, then woke to a text from Nolan. Big night. Try not to make this weird. I stared at it with one eye open and almost laughed. Weird, apparently, was a woman objecting to being fed to a lender at an anniversary party. I saved the message into Saturday evidence and made coffee strong enough to taste like punishment. At 8:06, my mother texted a photo of my blue dress from Easter 2 years ago. Wear this if it still fits, sweetheart. Family pictures will matter. That was how I knew she still believed the room belonged to her. The dress, the pictures, the toast, the notary, the soft music in the fellowship hall. She had built a stage where every detail was meant to make me smaller. I spent the morning making sure the stage had exits. Everett sent confirmation that Voss Capital had received the refusal letter. Keystone's fraud department confirmed the alert. The credit freezes came through before lunch, each email landing like a lock clicking into place. At 1:32, a new message came in from an old address Nolan had used years ago when I helped him set up online payments. He must have forgotten I was still copied on it. Graham Voss had replied to Lenora. Once she signs, we can proceed with revised collection terms. I forwarded it to Everett without adding a word. He answered 2 minutes later. Good. Let them bring the papers. I closed my laptop and looked at the 3 envelopes waiting beside my purse. For the first time in years, I was not going to Hawthorne Mill Road to fix something. I was going to let them show everyone exactly what they had broken. At 4:00 that afternoon, the fellowship hall at Street Anselm smelled like coffee, lemon sheet cake, and the kind of perfume women wear when they expect photographs. My mother had decorated every folding table with white carnations and pale blue ribbon. 35 years of marriage deserved beauty, she said. 35 years of marriage deserved witnesses. I understood that part better than she knew. I walked in wearing the blue dress because sometimes the easiest way to enter a trap is to look like you belong in it. My mother saw me from across the room and smiled like she had been waiting to forgive me for something. There she is, she said, loud enough for Aunt Maureen to turn around. My practical girl. Nolan stood near the punch bowl in a blazer that still had the store crease in the sleeves. Graham Voss was by the gift table, speaking quietly with my father. Sandra Elby from the credit union sat in the second row with a leather notary bag tucked beside her chair. Nobody brings a notary stamp to cut cake. I kept my purse on my shoulder and kissed my father's cheek. He smelled like aftershave and peppermint. He did not look directly at me. That told me more than any apology would have. On the gift table, half hidden behind a silver-wrapped box, sat a cream folder with Graham's logo on the corner. I recognized the color, the weight, the quiet arrogance of paper designed to outlive shame. My mother moved through the room touching shoulders, laughing softly, performing sacrifice like she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. After the blessing, after the photographs, after my father thanked everyone for standing with us through every season, my mother tapped a spoon against her glass. The room settled. She took my father's hand and said, "Family survives because someone is always willing to give a little more." People nodded. Aunt Maureen pressed a napkin under one eye. Then my mother turned toward me with the warmth of a spotlight. "Marin, sweetheart, come up here." I walked to the cake table. Graham opened the folder before I reached it. My mother laid a pen beside the top page and smiled for the room. "Marin has always been our practical one," she said. "Tonight she's going to help her brother keep the family business alive." A few people clapped. Nolan lifted his cup. "Come on, Mare," he said. "Don't make this weird." I looked at the page. My name was already typed under applicant guarantor. "What exactly are you asking me to sign, Mom?" Her smile tightened by a thread. "Just support papers, nothing dramatic." Graham stepped forward. "A standard family-backed restructure. Your brother only needs your confidence on paper." I nodded once, slowly, and turned the page toward the room. "Then you won't mind if everyone sees the word liable." The room did what rooms do when truth enters without permission. It got quiet in layers. First the clapping stopped, then the whispering. Then even the coffee urn in the corner sounded too loud. My mother's smile stayed on her face, but everything behind it moved. "Marin," she said, still soft, still performing. "Don't start parsing language in front of everyone. Graham already explained this. It's standard." Graham reached for the page. I kept my hand on it. "Standard for who?" I asked. "The person borrowing, or the person left paying?" Nolan laughed once, short and nervous. "Nobody's leaving you paying anything. It's just to buy time." That was the first honest thing he had said all night, and he did not even know it. I opened my purse and took out the first envelope. "The principal is $540,000, I said. "There are already $38,700 in penalties and late fees. This page makes me personally responsible if Nolan defaults." Aunt Maureen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sandra Elby sat back down. My mother's eyes flashed. "You are humiliating your brother over numbers." I laid Graham's email beside the guarantee. "No. Graham wrote that if I signed the personal guarantee and acknowledgement of joint liability, collection action against Nolan could pause." Graham's face hardened. "That correspondence is private." I looked at him. You brought a notary to my parents' anniversary party. You made it public. Someone near the back murmured. Joint liability? Tessa Pike, Maureen's niece, stepped closer, her phone lowered at her side, not filming me, just staring at the papers. Lenora reached for my wrist. I moved back before she touched me. I was protecting you from panic, she said. You get overwhelmed. You overthink. I opened the second envelope and placed her email on top. Marin may hesitate if she sees the full amount beforehand. I read. My voice did not shake. Bring the simplified signature page. We'll present it after the toast. She won't refuse if everyone is watching. The sentence landed exactly where she had meant to use it. In front of everyone watching. My father whispered my name. I turned to him because that was the wound I had saved for last. You knew. He looked older than he had 5 minutes before. Your mother was scared. I placed his email beside hers. Marin has always helped. She'll do what's right. Just don't upset Lenora at the party. He stared at the paper like it had betrayed him by existing. You didn't defend me, I said. You described my weakness to the people planning to use it. Nolan stepped forward, red-faced now. I'm your brother. I looked at him over the cake table, over the pen, over 35 years of marriage, turned into a trap. Then you should have known my name is not collateral. I took out the final envelope. Everett's refusal letter, the fraud alert confirmation, the credit freeze notices, all dated before the party. Graham read the first page and went pale. Sandra picked up her notary bag. I'm not stamping anything in this room, she said. That was when my mother finally understood the room was no longer hers. Graham Voss closed the folder with both hands, slowly, like sudden movement might make the documents louder. My mother grabbed his sleeve and whispered, You said this would work. He looked at her then, not like a friend, not like a savior, but like a lender staring at a liability. It works when families tell the truth about consent, he said. The sentence was quiet, but 3 people near the cake table heard it. Aunt Maureen heard it. Tessa heard it. My father heard it, and looked at the floor again. Nolan was the first to break. So what am I supposed to do now? He snapped, as if the problem were my refusal and not the $500,000 hole he had dug under his own name. I looked at him, and for once I did not soften the answer. The same thing I was supposed to do if I signed, I said. Carry it. My mother made a sound like I had slapped him. I hadn't. I had only handed the debt back to the man who made it. Within 72 hours, Voss Capital sent notice that Nolan no longer qualified for restructuring without a guarantor. 2 weeks later, 2 trailers were repossessed from a gravel lot outside Harrisburg. Nolan stood there in a hoodie, yelling into his phone, while the tow driver hooked the second hitch. A cousin sent me the photo, then apologized for sending it. I did not answer. Some consequences do not need commentary. By the end of the month, Whitlock Roadway Rentals had no office, no expansion, and no Sunset logo left except the poster board still leaning in my parents' garage. My mother tried to turn the family against me. She called Maureen first, then half the women from church, telling them I had embarrassed her on the most important night of her marriage. But for the first time, people asked numbers. How much debt, Lenora? What papers? Why was Sandra there? Tessa had seen the emails. Maureen had seen the receipts. My mother's story did not collapse all at once. It lost air slowly, the way balloons do after a party no one wants to clean up. My father asked to meet me at a diner near Keystone 3 weeks later. He talked about rain for 4 minutes before he said, I was only trying to keep peace. I stirred my coffee and looked at the man who had taught me to answer every emergency, then signed me toward one. No, Dad, I said. You kept peace by handing me the war. His eyes filled. I let them. Tears were not an apology, and silence was not innocence anymore. I stopped paying every bill that did not have my name on it. No insurance gaps, no Nolan emergencies, no quiet rescues wrapped in family language. In November, I bought a small townhouse on the edge of Lancaster, 2 bedrooms, old floors, a narrow porch, and a kitchen window that caught morning light. Sybil brought me rosemary in a clay pot and said, "Some plants grow better after they're moved out of bad soil." I planted it by the steps. The first night I slept there, I put hawthorn receipts and Saturday evidence in a storage box on the closet shelf. Not because I wanted to forget, because I finally had walls that did not require proof of what I was worth. My mother once thought everyone watching would make me sign. She was half right. Everyone watched. But what they saw was the day I stopped signing for love, and my name finally belonged to me. What Marin learned was not just about debt papers, credit freezes, or signatures. It was about the quiet price some people pay to stay loved, by people who only value them when they are useful. That is a painful lesson, because usefulness can feel like love for a very long time. When someone calls you dependable, needed, practical, strong, or the one who always understands, it can sound like praise. But sometimes those words are not praise at all. Sometimes they are a job description, written by people who have no intention of paying you back, thanking you, or protecting you when the cost becomes too high. Family should never require you to destroy your future to prove your loyalty. Love should not come with a signature line. It should not demand your credit, your savings, your health, your peace, or your ability to sleep at night. Real love does not wait until there are witnesses to pressure you. Real love does not hide the full amount. Real love does not say, "If you cared, you would sign." Real love gives you the truth before it asks for help. And sometimes the hardest part of healing is accepting that the people who raised you may still not have the right to use you. You can honor your family without becoming their escape plan. You can love someone and still say no. You can forgive a person in your heart and still keep your doors locked, your papers safe, and your name off the debt they created. Marin did not win because she became cruel. She won because she finally became clear. She stopped confusing being needed with being loved. She stopped letting guilt make financial decisions. She stopped waiting for people who benefited from her silence to suddenly reward her honesty. So if you are the one who always fixes things, pays quietly, shows up tired, and gets called selfish the moment you set a boundary, remember this: your life is not collateral. Your peace is not a family fund. Your name belongs to you. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about quiet people finally choosing themselves, and tell me in the comments: have you ever had to say no to someone who thought your love meant unlimited access to your life?